Beneath the smoke of ruined cities and the silence of buried bunkers lies a story never meant to be spoken aloud. Wars end on paper, but in the shadows they do not die. They twist, recoil, and burrow deeper. Forgotten signals still hum across dead frequencies, and sealed crates moulder in vaults where no visitor is allowed to tread. What appears as silence is often a locked room with voices waiting behind its doors, their secrets pressing against the cracks. Every burned document, every erased file, every name struck from a roster leaves behind an echo, and those echoes refuse to be quiet. In the rubble of old conflicts lie half-built machines, lost missions, and whispers of betrayals that survived the flames. Tonight, we open one of those hidden rooms, and in doing so, step into a silence that has been carefully guarded for generations. Once the door creaks open, there is no closing it again. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Convoy of Murmansk. On the night of November 18, 1943, the Arctic was at its most unforgiving. A convoy of merchant vessels, escorted by Royal Navy destroyers, ploughed through the storm-churned waters of the Barents Sea. The mission was logged as Convoy PQ-79, though the designation appears only in fragments across scattered Admiralty files. Official naval records state that PQ-79 never existed, yet testimonies from surviving sailors suggest otherwise. According to them, it was no ordinary supply run. Beneath the tarpaulins and false manifests, crates of advanced radio countermeasure prototypes, codenamed Blackbird, were bound for Murmansk, intended to be rushed by rail to Moscow. The devices, still experimental, were rumoured to jam the Würzburg radar systems guiding the Luftwaffe's night fighters and potentially cripple the German Kammhuber line. The convoy had departed from Loch Ewe, Scotland, under the command of Captain Reginald F. Holt of HMS Vigilant, a veteran of Arctic escort duties. Weather reports from RAF Coastal Command that week noted gale-force winds and heavy snow squalls drifting off the Norwegian coast, ideal conditions for concealment, but lethal for navigation. German intelligence, however, seemed prepared. B-Dienst intercepts at Kiel reportedly decrypted the preliminary sailing orders, and U-boats from the 11th Flotilla at Narvik were dispatched to intercept. Survivors recalled strange signals echoing across their radios on the third day. Bursts of static and distorted Morse that seemed to mimic Allied traffic before dissolving into silence. By November 22nd, PQ-79 had disappeared entirely. No official loss reports were filed, no wreckage documented in Admiralty logs. What remained were fragments buried in Soviet archives, discovered decades later. An NKVD memorandum dated December 3, 1943, referenced foreign equipment salvaged under emergency measures near the Kola Peninsula. A recovery unit of divers from the Soviet Northern Fleet was deployed, though the operation's outcome is redacted in every surviving file. Witnesses in Murmansk spoke of a heavily guarded train convoy departing at night, its cargo sealed in lead-lined containers. None of the equipment ever resurfaced in Soviet inventories. In 1957, Norwegian fishermen operating off Tromsø netted what appeared to be pieces of a British freighter's hull. One claimed he saw fragments of metal stamped with serial codes inconsistent with any standard Admiralty issue. The debris was immediately confiscated by Soviet patrol boats, which declared the fine part of routine salvage operations. Years later, a retired Norwegian naval officer described seeing documents marked with the stamp of the Ministry for State Security, suggesting that Soviet forces had continued monitoring the wreck site into the 1960s. The western side remained silent. When researchers from the Imperial War Museum requested records of PQ-79 in the 1970s, the Admiralty responded with a terse statement. No such convoy is listed among operational records. Yet private correspondence uncovered from the estate of Commander Holt in 1984 tells a different story. In a letter addressed to his wife dated January 1944, Holt wrote, "I am bound by oath never to speak of the voyage lost to the ice. The burden of silence is heavier than the sea itself." The letter was marked, "Not to be published," and filed away with his personal effects. Theories surrounding the disappearance vary. One suggests that the convoy was deliberately sacrificed, a decoy designed to draw German U-boats away from a larger and more critical supply run. Another posits that Soviet forces intercepted the convoy themselves, seeking to secure the countermeasure prototypes without British oversight. Evidence supporting this includes Soviet Navy logs, indicating unusual submarine activity north of Murmansk in late November 1943. Third theory claims the equipment was too dangerous to risk falling into German hands and was scuttled by its own escorts after interception became inevitable. In 1991, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, partial transcripts from the archives of the Northern Fleet were leaked. Among them was a report describing foreign material compromised under hostile fire, subsequent destruction required. The phrasing implies that whatever the convoy carried may have been partially recovered, partially lost. Details of the engagement are absent, though references to enemy vessels shadowing under storm cover suggest a complex battle concealed by weather. Still, no confirmed German records exist of such an encounter, raising the possibility that the engagement never reached Berlin's naval command, or that the Soviets eliminated all surviving witnesses. Decades after the war, in remote fishing villages along Norway's Arctic coast, stories persist of ghostly ships glimpsed through the snow squalls, vessels that vanish as quickly as they appear. Some locals insist they are echoes of PQ-79, still drifting through the frozen night. Yet the most compelling evidence lies in the silence of officialdom. Both London and Moscow refuse to acknowledge the convoy's existence, and attempts by researchers to access relevant files meet only with closed archives and blank responses. The disappearance of PQ-79 has become a void in the narrative of the Arctic convoys. Unlike the documented tragedies of PQ-17 and PQ-18, this convoy lingers in the shadows, denied by those who should remember it most. The silence suggests that the cargo was more than just machines. If the Blackbird devices were real, their disappearance reshaped the timeline of electronic warfare. If they were destroyed, their secrets sank into the icy depths of the Barents. If they were taken, then someone has guarded them in silence for 80 years. The forgotten convoy remains frozen in time, a chapter erased from history yet whispered in fragments. An Arctic storm that swallowed men, ships, and secrets, leaving only silence in its wake. The Barents Sea guards the truth still, beneath black waters that reflect nothing but the cold northern sky. Chapter 2. Shadows Beneath Operation Paperclip. On May 2, 1945, as Berlin burned and Soviet artillery thundered across the Spree, a train of sealed boxcars departed from a freight yard outside Augsburg. Its contents never appeared in any Wehrmacht manifest, and its destination was carefully erased from Reichsbahn records. Decades later, fragments of OSS correspondence surfaced, referring cryptically to Eclipse Transport 17, a movement designed to secure material before Soviet troops advanced. While Operation Paperclip is remembered as a scientific harvest of Nazi expertise, this parallel effort, known in whispers as Project Eclipse, was about seizing the documents and prototypes that could tilt the balance of post-war power. The Americans were not alone. NKVD officers, operating under cover of the Soviet military administration, tracked the same shipments. Their reports, preserved in partially declassified Moscow files, speak of cargo deemed decisive for atomic priority. Among the contested spoils were chemical propellant research from the Peenemünde facility, advanced guidance schematics for the A9 and A10 missile projects, and experimental fuels supposedly capable of sustaining flight beyond the stratosphere. Yet no Allied communique mentions these specific recoveries. Instead, the documents vanish, their contents absorbed into the blank spaces of history. What little can be reconstructed comes from overlapping testimonies. Dr. Walter Henschel, an aeronautical engineer captured near Munich, told American interrogators in June 1945 that entire teams of scientists had been redirected away from known facilities and loaded onto trains bound for the Harz Mountains. The trains, he claimed, carried not only personnel but steel drums sealed with bitumen, marked with the insignia of the Reich Air Ministry. When pressed for detail, Henschel grew silent, insisting he had already said too much. His testimony was classified by the War Department and remained sealed until 1981, when fragments appeared in a foyer release. In the American zone, Major Robert Staver of the Army Ordnance Corps was already compiling lists of German scientists for Paperclip, yet his personal diary, recovered posthumously by his family, contains repeated references to a shadow operation he was ordered not to interfere with. On May 14, 1945, Staver noted, "Consignment Eclipse continues under G2 authority. Trainloads redirected without record. My team excluded. Suspect atomic or bio connection. Silence mandatory." His handwriting is erratic, and later pages are torn out. None of these remarks appear in his official service record. Soviet accounts are equally opaque. A 1946 NKVD memorandum to Lavrenti, Beria references lost trains along the Thuringian corridor and orders the establishment of permanent monitoring stations in the Soviet zone to intercept future eclipse movements. The wording suggests the Soviets failed to seize at least some of the cargo, which may have slipped into American hands. Yet no Allied victory reports celebrate such a find. The silence indicates deliberate erasure, an agreement to bury what could never be admitted. Eyewitnesses lend further detail, though at the price of contradiction. A US Army signals officer, interviewed in 1963 under the pseudonym Carter, recalled guarding a train at night near Kassel. The cars were heavily padlocked, with orders that no personnel approach within 20 yards. He swore he smelled an acrid chemical odor, like burning ether, seeping from the seams of the boxcars. Within days, the train was gone, rerouted into the American sector. Carter claimed his commanding officer later warned him never to mention the incident. He never did publicly. His taped interview was sealed by the Army Historical Division until after his death. The fate of the missing cargo remains unknown, but faint trails surface in Cold War programs. Declassified CIA reports from the early 1950s note an unexplained technological acceleration in Soviet missile propellants, one that Western analysts attributed to captured German work. Yet parallel concerns in Washington pointed to unexplained American advances in liquid hydrogen research, developments that arrived too quickly to be coincidental. Some researchers believe the Eclipse trains were divided, their contents split in an unspoken bargain between East and West. Others argue that much of the material never reached either side, lost or deliberately destroyed in the chaos of collapsing fronts. One lingering question is whether Project Eclipse was sanctioned at the highest levels or improvised by mid-level intelligence officers, determined to outmaneuver their rivals. OSS memoranda, declassified in 2005, reveal intense friction between American and British teams during the final weeks of the war. A cable, dated April 30th, 1945, from OSS Station Bern to Washington, contains the warning: British request restraint regarding Eclipse operations. Their duplicity cannot be discounted. It suggests that even among allies, the project was a matter of mistrust and secrecy. By the Cold War, Eclipse had disappeared from official vocabulary. Operation Paperclip filled the public narrative, presenting a sanitized story of scientists repurposed for rockets, aviation, and medicine. The darker layers, chemical warheads, unstable fuels, records of human experimentation, were erased. In 1974, an investigative journalist named Harold Weston published a book claiming that Eclipse shipments were buried at a site in Nevada under the guise of nuclear testing. His evidence relied on unnamed military sources, and his work was dismissed as sensationalism. Yet his death, in what police called a vehicular accident, left questions lingering. His notes vanished from his apartment, reportedly seized by federal agents. Modern attempts to track Eclipse material have been obstructed by classification barriers. FOIA requests return heavily redacted documents, with pages of black ink where train schedules and personnel names should be. Soviet-era archives are no more generous. Russian military historians hint at missing files in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense, but no access has been granted. The silence from both sides, after nearly 80 years, suggests a pact of mutual concealment. Today, only whispers remain. In private circles of military historians, Eclipse is spoken of as the operation that never was, an empty train running through the ruins of Europe. But the fragments tell otherwise. Boxcars sealed under armed guard, documents erased from inventory, and a silence too deliberate to be accidental. Whether the cargo held the seeds of intercontinental missiles, unstable atomic fuels, or even darker weapons is unknown. What is certain is that men risked their lives to erase its trail, leaving only shadows beneath Paperclip, where history ends in silence and speculation. Chapter 3: The Silent Bunkers of Lower Silesia. In the final years of the Third Reich, as defeat loomed and cities fell beneath Allied bombing raids, the Nazi regime poured resources into a colossal underground project buried deep within the Aal Mountains of Lower Silesia. The effort was codenamed Ries, German for giant, and officially described as the construction of command headquarters and secure factories. Yet the sheer scale of the excavations, the secrecy surrounding them, and the disappearance of thousands of forced laborers attached to the project hint at a purpose far more sinister. The Reich allocated millions of Reichsmarks to Riesa, diverting manpower and materials even as the front collapsed. By 1945, Allied aerial reconnaissance revealed little more than camouflaged entrances, though later ground surveys confirmed a labyrinth of tunnels reinforced with concrete thicker than anything used for conventional bunkers. Contemporary records from Organisation Todt, the Reich's Civil and Military Engineering Group, describe the Ries construction as Category S, a classification reserved for works deemed vital to state survival. Over 30,000 prisoners, many from Gross-Rosen concentration camp, were marched daily into the mountains. Few emerged alive. Their labour carved out vast halls, some large enough to house aircraft or rocket fuselages. Post-war Polish commissions, investigating the site in the late 1940s, found tools and skeletons cemented into the walls. The Germans had dynamited sections as they retreated, collapsing shafts and sealing tunnels. Even so, surviving chambers gave investigators glimpses of scale. Rooms with air vents designed for heavy machinery, concrete walls capable of withstanding deep penetrating bombs, and rail tracks leading into unfinished caverns. The official explanation, that the site was intended as an alternate Führer headquarters, fails to account for the design features uncovered. In 1954, a Polish geologist named Janusz Kordel discovered fragments of reinforced flooring coated with unusual metallic residue. His report, classified by the Ministry of National Defense, suggested the residue was consistent with high-temperature testing, perhaps linked to propulsion or weapons development. Around the same time, Soviet Army archives record the removal of technological artifacts from Ries, loaded onto sealed convoys bound for Moscow. These shipments are absent from Polish records, but witnesses in the village of Walim swore they saw trucks, guarded by Red Army soldiers moving nightly for weeks after the war's end. Interrogations of SS officers captured in 1946 provide further intrigue. On, Obersturmbannführer Franz Dörner insisted under questioning that Riese was intended for das Endgerät, the final device. His interrogators pressed him for clarification, but his answers grew evasive. He claimed the device was not conventional, not a rocket, not a bomb, but a thing that changes the balance. Within days, he was found dead in his cell. His death officially ruled suicide. His statements were buried in Allied interrogation transcripts, rediscovered only when Cold War researchers sifted through archives decades later. The tunnels themselves became a Cold War battleground of secrets. In 1962, Polish miners digging near the complex broke into a collapsed shaft. Inside, they discovered crates with the Reich Eagle insignia, waterlogged but intact. Before local officials could inventory the find, units of the Polish Security Service, UB, cordoned off the area and confiscated the crates. Workers later whispered that they had glimpsed cylinders filled with strange wiring and corroded valves. Nothing was publicly acknowledged. Shortly thereafter, Soviet military advisors arrived in the region and ordered the shaft resealed. Miners involved in the discovery were reassigned or silenced. Western intelligence took interest as well. A CIA memo from 1971, declassified in fragments, noted increased surveillance of Silesian tunnel systems and recommended high-altitude reconnaissance flights over the Owl Mountains. The memo cited possible storage of classified Soviet material in pre-existing German structures. Analysts speculated the tunnels were being reused as depots for Warsaw Pact weapons. Yet aerial photos revealed little beyond overgrown forests and camouflaged access points. Locals reported unmarked trucks entering the hills at night, sometimes escorted by military police. No official explanation was offered. The mythology of Ries grew as decades passed. Treasure hunters descended on the region, searching for gold, lost art, or hidden archives. In 2015, 2 men claimed they had located a buried gold train near Wałbrzych, allegedly sealed in a tunnel. Ground-penetrating radar showed anomalies, but excavations revealed nothing. Still, the obsession with Ries persists, fueled by stories of hidden chambers and unexplored shafts. Beneath the legends, however, remains a consistent thread: secrecy, reinforced walls, and a purpose never acknowledged by official history. Perhaps the most chilling account comes from a 1945 report by a Soviet engineer named Mikhail Ivanov, recovered in 1993 after the collapse of the USSR. Ivanov described entering a chamber lined with massive steel conduits and ceramic insulators. Unlike anything he had seen in conventional facilities, the room appeared designed to withstand high electrical loads. He concluded the chamber was part of a test rig, possibly for experimental energy weapons or propulsion systems. His report ended with the phrase, "The equipment was removed under directive and the site sealed. Future visits not authorized." Nothing more is known of Ivanov. His report is missing from official Russian archives, existing only as a single carbon copy smuggled to the West. The fate of Rees remains uncertain. The Owl Mountains still contain miles of unexplored tunnels, sealed by wartime demolitions and subsequent military intervention. Poland occasionally opens sections of the complex to tourists, presenting the sanitized narrative of a failed Führer headquarters. Yet large areas remain off-limits, fenced and patrolled, under the pretense of safety hazards. Local villagers speak of unexplained vibrations in the ground, of nights when the forest hums as though machinery still runs beneath. Some claim Soviet engineers never fully dismantled what they found, instead burying it deeper. History records Rees as an incomplete project, abandoned in the chaos of 1945. But the evidence, classified reports, confiscated artifacts, intercepted memos, suggests it was more than bunkers. It was a fortress for secrets, a vault for technologies that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. Whether those technologies were destroyed, hidden, or absorbed into Soviet and American programs remains unknown. The silence surrounding Rees speaks louder than official denials. Beneath the mountains, the concrete halls remain, empty yet waiting, monuments to a war that ended, but left shadows no less dangerous than the weapons themselves. Chapter 4. The Erased Files of Dresden Raid. On the night of February 13, 1945, over 770 RAF bombers crossed into German airspace, their payloads of high explosives and incendiaries, destined for one of Europe's most celebrated cultural cities, Dresden. The destruction that followed became infamous, a firestorm that obliterated entire districts and claimed tens of thousands of lives. Yet buried within the operational paperwork of Bomber Command lies a reference to an objective never publicly acknowledged. Target Z-14. Unlike factories or railway hubs, Z-14 was not listed on official target maps. Surviving fragments of declassified air staff memoranda suggest it referred to a subterranean archive beneath Dresden's government quarter, where the Reich had begun consolidating intelligence seized across occupied Europe. Rumors of the archive's existence had circulated among Allied intelligence circles since late 1944. Intercepts from resistance networks in France hinted that captured communications, agent lists, and even partial Enigma decrypts were stored there. If true, the archive posed a catastrophic threat. It could expose Allied double agents, reveal the scope of underground resistance networks, and compromise future operations. By early February, Dresden was swollen with refugees, and its strategic value appeared minimal. Yet air staff discussions, recorded in a January 29th briefing transcript, debated Dresden as a legitimate intelligence target, not merely a cultural center. One officer wrote in the margin of his copy, "Z-14 must not fall into Soviet hands." When the bombing commenced, witnesses described a precision in the opening wave unusual for city raids. High explosive markers fell squarely across the government quarter before the incendiary storm spread beyond control. Surviving SS reports, recovered in the Bundesarchiv decades later, mention Einsatzgruppen units combing the ruins in the aftermath. Their orders were explicit: secure priority containers from collapsed bunkers. Several eyewitnesses recalled armed cordons surrounding a particular street near the Regierungsviertel, where soldiers carried heavy metal cases into trucks despite the city still burning. The trucks drove east, toward the zone soon to be occupied by the Red Army. None of the containers were ever recovered. The American 8th Air Force joined the bombing 2 days later, deepening the destruction. But an internal USAAF memo dated February 18, 1945, suggests unease. It refers to collateral intelligence assets compromised during Dresden operation and notes urgent consultation with British counterparts. The language is vague, yet the implication is clear. Allied intelligence knew that something of value had been lost or obscured in the fires. Subsequent mission reports omit any mention of Z-14. By March, the codename vanishes entirely from correspondence. When the Soviets arrived, they encountered ruins still smoldering. NKVD after-action reports, declassified in the early 1990s, describe foreign material extracted under SS supervision prior to our arrival. They note sealed containers marked with Wehrmacht insignia and conclude that the cargo had been evacuated in haste. Curiously, one Soviet officer's field diary, preserved in a private collection, claims that among the debris they found fragments of Allied cipher pads, charred but legible enough to confirm they were not German origin. If accurate, this suggests the archive contained material captured directly from Allied networks, an intelligence breach never acknowledged in official history. The fate of Z-14 remains clouded. Some historians argue it was a deliberate cover story, an excuse to justify the annihilation of Dresden before Soviet occupation. Others believe it was real, pointing to unexplained breakdowns in Allied intelligence operations after the raid. In April 1945, several French resistance cells were compromised in rapid succession, their leaders arrested by remnants of the Gestapo. The timing led post-war analysts to suspect that lists recovered from Dresden had been transferred before the city fell. Yet official British records dismiss the connection, attributing the arrests to unrelated leaks. Post-war trials shed occasional light. At Nuremberg, a mid-level SS officer named Wilhelm Krüger testified about his assignment in Dresden during February 1945. He claimed he guarded safes from the archive cellars as they were loaded into trucks. When asked under oath what the safes contained, he hesitated before replying. Foreign papers, lists, communications. His statement was not pursued further, and the transcript was buried among lesser evidence files. Only decades later did researchers rediscover the testimony. By then, Krüger had vanished, reportedly emigrating under a false identity. Cold War intelligence agencies continued to probe Dresden's ruins. In 1952, the CIA conducted a covert survey of the Regierungsviertel under the pretense of cultural restoration. Field notes from the mission, partially declassified in 2007, describe sealed vaults beneath layers of rubble. One vault, breached with difficulty, contained nothing but scorched shelves and melted file boxes. Yet the agents concluded the vault had been emptied deliberately before the bombing. Their report closes with the stark phrase, "Archives sanitized prior to capture." The Soviets likely reached the same conclusion. By the late 20th century, Dresden had become a symbol of wartime destruction, the narrative of cultural tragedy overshadowing all else. But in closed circles of intelligence historians, Target Z-14 remains an obsession. FOIA requests filed in the 1980s for records mentioning the codename returned only denials. No such files exist. Yet handwritten annotations in RAF Bomber Command archives show the phrase Z-14 priority scrawled across mission briefs. The contradiction is glaring. Files exist, but their existence is officially denied. Survivors of Allied networks continued to speak of betrayals traceable only to early 1945. French resistance leader Henri Vallon, interviewed shortly before his death, claimed he lost half his network because of a list taken to Dresden. He could never prove it, but the bitterness remained. Similarly, a former SOE operative, in a private letter preserved at the Imperial War Museum, referred to the Dresden betrayal as the darkest chapter of his career. His words were never published. The erasure of Z-14 is itself telling. No operation so carefully hidden lacks significance. Dresden was incinerated not only to cripple German morale, but perhaps to bury evidence too dangerous to survive the war. Whether those files contained Allied secrets, Nazi research, or both, the deliberate silence afterward ensured that the archive's true nature would remain obscured. The fire consumed more than a city. It consumed a record of intelligence wars fought in the shadows, leaving behind only ash, silence, and suspicion. In Dresden's ruins, history was not only destroyed, it was rewritten. Chapter 5: Ghost Signals of the Berlin Divide. In the spring of 1948, as the ruins of Berlin hardened into occupation zones and the first outlines of the Cold War emerged from the rubble, British and American intelligence services launched a series of covert operations to intercept Soviet communications and secure what remained of the Reich's vast military infrastructure. One such effort, known internally as Operation HARP, focused on a cluster of abandoned Wehrmacht relay bunkers beneath the city's bombed-out industrial quarter. The mission's stated objective was routine: locate and tap Soviet command cables laid through the rubble. But what they discovered suggested something far stranger. Signals still emanating from the depths, long after the Wehrmacht itself had ceased to exist. According to surviving field reports, the first anomalies were detected on June 4, 1948, by a British signals detachment attached to the Royal Corps of Signals. Monitoring equipment deployed beneath a collapsed telephone exchange on Ritterstrasse recorded bursts of encrypted Morse traffic every evening between 0200 and 0230 hours. The transmissions were faint, their origin impossible to triangulate, and their structure unlike any known Soviet cipher. What unsettled the technicians most was the call sign that opened each sequence. HKT-47, a prefix associated with a Wehrmacht communications hub destroyed in 1945. British cryptanalysts initially assumed they were intercepting a Soviet deception operation. Yet attempts to decode the messages yielded nothing but meaningless character strings. Operation HARP intensified. Teams from the American Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, joined British engineers to map Berlin's subterranean relay networks. They found that many of the bunkers, sealed by Allied forces in 1945, had been re-entered. Evidence of recent tampering, cut wiring, freshly installed junction boxes, and unmarked power cables suggested someone had resumed operations below the streets. The discoveries alarmed both sides. If the Soviets were using abandoned Wehrmacht infrastructure to transmit intelligence traffic, it represented a dangerous blind spot in Allied surveillance. Yet Soviet officials, when confronted through back channels, denied all knowledge. Privately, they accused the West of fabricating the story to justify their own espionage. The truth was stranger still. On July 12, 1948, a CIC field team succeeded in tracing one of the transmission cables to an underground relay room beneath a bombed-out brewery in Kreuzberg. The chamber contained obsolete Wehrmacht switching equipment coated in dust, yet the transmitters were powered and active. The room appeared hastily abandoned, as if whoever had been there fled minutes before the Americans arrived. A single spool of punched tape lay in the corner, its patterns defying cryptographic analysis. Curiously, the tape contained no operational orders, no coordinates, no recognizable language, only long strings of numbers broken by irregular pauses. Some analysts suspected they were coordinates, others believed they encoded names. None could be proven. In the weeks that followed, more ghost signals appeared, not just in Berlin, but across the Soviet zone. Monitoring stations at Helmstedt, Lübeck, and Frankfurt picked up identical bursts on the same nightly schedule. The signals shared a peculiar characteristic. They originated from within German territory, but their strength suggested transmission from deep underground. Allied intelligence grew convinced they were dealing with a remnant network, perhaps a stay-behind communications grid activated by former Nazi officers. The British Foreign Office drafted a memo in September 1948, describing the possibility of an organized underground escape network, utilizing pre-war relay infrastructure for coordination. The memo was classified top secret and buried in the archives. Soviet intelligence, too, appears to have been aware. A KGB field report from early 1949, declassified after the fall of the USSR, notes irregular German origin signals interfering with Red Army communications. It recommends neutralization of rogue transmission nodes and identifies HARP-type activity as a Western provocation. This accusation is telling. The Soviets believed the signals were deliberate psychological operations designed to disorient their command structure. Yet the frequency and pattern of the bursts continued unchanged, even after Soviet countermeasures began. What lends the ghost signals their enduring mystery is their persistence. In 1952, 4 years after the initial detections, American monitoring stations recorded the same HKT-47 traffic, identical pulse sequences, identical schedule. No source was ever identified. In 1957, as tensions over the Berlin airlift faded into stalemate, British MI6 engineers attempted a new interception technique, using magnetic tape to capture the entire transmission cycle. The recording revealed a chilling detail. Embedded in the noise floor of the signal was a repeated German phrase, nearly inaudible without advanced filtering. It translated roughly as, "The list is not complete." The discovery deepened fears that the transmissions contained information about wanted Nazi officials or covert agents still operating in Europe. Attempts to trace the network proved futile. Teams sealed suspected relay bunkers, yet the signals continued. Known transmitters were dismantled, but the broadcasts adapted to new frequencies. One theory proposed that the transmissions were automated, set to broadcast indefinitely from devices buried deep underground. Another speculated that the network had been co-opted by intelligence agencies, possibly even by both sides, who found it too useful to dismantle. Whatever the case, by the time the Berlin Wall rose in 1961, Operation Harp was quietly shelved, its files sealed under Official Secrets Act provisions. The mystery resurfaced briefly in 1974, when a West German ham radio operator inadvertently intercepted a fragment of what appeared to be the original Hartke T-47 signal. The content was identical to recordings from 1948. Federal intelligence dismissed the incident as atmospheric interference, but a subsequent internal memo from the Bundesnachrichtendienst, BND, warned of unexplained legacy transmissions of indeterminate origin. The memo remains classified. Even as late as 1983, during NATO's Able Archer exercises, a SIGINT sweep detected brief Morse bursts matching the ghost signal's signature, this time emanating from near the Polish border. The Cold War was nearly 4 decades old, yet the wartime code still pulsed beneath its surface. After German reunification, researchers sought to investigate the original relay sites. Many had been demolished or sealed with concrete. Those that remained accessible contained only stripped equipment and empty chambers. Yet in one site beneath Treptow, investigators found a small metal plaque bolted to a wall, inscribed simply with the words "Für die Namen," for the names. It remains unclear who placed it there, or when. The legacy of Operation Harp endures as one of the most enigmatic chapters of the early Cold War. The signals it chased were never decoded, their purpose never explained. Were they remnants of a defeated regime's last act of resistance, an automated system stubbornly echoing across decades? Were they the product of clandestine Allied or Soviet experiments, repurposing history's debris for new battles? Or were they something more personal? Lists of fugitives, messages to men hiding under false identities, the unfinished work of a vanished state. No answer has ever been confirmed. In the end, the ghost signals remain, as they always were, fleeting pulses in the static, stubbornly defying interpretation. Like Berlin itself, divided, scarred, layered with the past, they embody the unresolved tension between memory and forgetting. Their transmissions, if they still exist, are more than relics. They are a reminder that wars do not end cleanly. Their echoes, like the signals beneath the Berlin Divide, continue to whisper in the dark long after the guns fall silent. What lingers after the firestorm is not peace, but questions, each one a shadow longer than the last. Bunkers collapse, ships sink, and archives turn to ash, yet fragments remain like shards of a mirror, hinting at something vast we are never permitted to see whole. Perhaps that is the design, to leave us chasing whispers, suspecting more than we can prove, and wondering if the silence is protection or warning. Every erased line in a file is an invitation to imagine what was too dangerous to keep. The deeper one digs, the colder the air becomes, as though the earth itself resists giving up what it holds. And so the record ends where it always must, in half-light, with more doors locked than opened, and the uneasy knowledge that some truths lie waiting, patient and untouched in the dark.